The hum of the alien starport buzzed beneath Zoric's boots as he led his crew into the shadows, their footsteps drowned by the constant din of interstellar traffic. His black eyes gleamed with anticipation. "One job," he muttered, glancing over his shoulder at his team. "Just one. Steal the tech, sell it, and we'll be rich." His crew, a ragtag band of smugglers from different planets, nodded nervously. They weren't used to this much heat. Earth's technology was highly guarded, and for good reason. But Zorik had a reputation. He'd stolen from the best and walked away without so much as a scratch. He didn't intend for tonight to be any different. They slipped through the outer gates, bypassing the low-level security drones that buzzed lazily above them. Zorik's fingers danced over his wrist pad, disabling the perimeter alarms. His breath quickened as they approached the gleaming white cargo bay marked with the emblem of the United Earth Federation. Inside, their prize awaited, a prototype defense system, rumored to be more powerful than anything in the galaxy. It was worth billions. "Careful!" hissed Zerk, his second in command, a hulking reptilian with amber eyes that darted nervously in every direction. "I've heard rumors about these humans." Zorik scoffed, his grin widening. "Humans? They're soft. Grew up on a backwater death world. The only thing dangerous about them is their arrogance." Inside the cargo bay, the room was filled with Earth-made tech, sleek, minimal, but unmistakably powerful. In the center, suspended in a transparent containment field, was the prototype. Zorik's pulse quickened. This was it. The culmination of months of planning. "Get the device," he ordered. Zerk stepped forward, hands shaking slightly as he reached for the containment field's control panel. The lights flickered as the field deactivated. The room seemed to hold its breath. The prototype was theirs. A low beep echoed through the chamber. Zorik froze. That wasn't part of the plan. "What did you do?" he snapped at Zerk. "I didn't." Zerk's voice faltered as the sound grew louder, a rhythmic pulse filling the air. "Tracker," Zorik whispered, his grin fading. "Move! Now!" They bolted for the exit, the prototype tucked under Zerk's arm. But the damage was done. In their haste, they hadn't noticed the figure watching them from the shadows. Dane leaned against the cold metal wall of the adjacent cargo bay, watching the smugglers make their escape. His eyes narrowed. He'd been in the wrong place at the right time. On leave after a grueling campaign, all he wanted was some peace. Instead, he was watching a crew of overconfident thieves steal classified Earth tech right under his nose. "Idiots," he muttered, pulling his sidearm from its holster. He could let them go. After all, he wasn't on duty. But Earth's defense systems weren't just important, they were critical. If those smugglers got away with that prototype, it wouldn't just be Earth at risk. The entire galaxy could face chaos. He keyed into his communicator. "Control, this is Dane. We have a breach at Hangar 12. Unauthorized personnel have taken a classified prototype. I'm going after them." The voice on the other end was calm but firm. "Copy that, Sergeant. Backup is en route. Stay on them." Dane holstered his weapon and took off at a sprint. He didn't need backup. He was a Deathworlder, after all, and he'd faced far worse than a handful of alien thieves. The smugglers may have thought they were clever, but they had no idea what kind of nightmare they'd just unleashed. The chase began. Zorik's crew fled through the labyrinthine corridors of the starport, the tracker's beep growing louder in their ears. Every second was precious. They had to get off planet before the humans caught wind of what had happened. But Zorik couldn't shake the feeling that they were already too late. Behind them, Dane moved silently, a shadow on their trail. He was patient. Deathworlders were always patient. They knew when to strike, when the prey was cornered, when panic had set in, when hope was a distant memory. "Let's see how soft you think humans are now," Dane whispered to himself as he closed the distance. Through the starport. The cold steel of the starport's winding corridors reflected dim, artificial light as Zorik's crew darted through the maze of tunnels, desperate to shake the invisible weight of pursuit. The rhythmic beeping of the tracker under Zerk's arm pressed into their skulls like a countdown to their inevitable capture. "Shut that thing off!" Zorak barked, glancing over his shoulder, eyes wide with paranoia. His normally cocky swagger had long since evaporated, replaced by the calculating sharpness of survival. The crew wasn't moving fast enough, and every corner they turned felt like a trap. "I'm trying!" Zerk's claws fumbled with the wrist pad connected to the stolen prototype. His bulky frame, normally a source of intimidation, now seemed more of a hindrance as he struggled to disable the tracker's signal. The small device blinked with red lights, taunting them with every failed attempt. "You said the humans were soft!" Zerk growled, his amber eyes full of panic. "They are!" Zorak shot back, but the words felt hollow even to him. Everything had gone wrong. The humans weren't supposed to react this quickly, let alone send a soldier on their tail within minutes of the theft. How could they have known? Before Zorak could think of a response, the lights in the corridor dimmed, momentarily, but just enough to make their collective hearts skip a beat. "It's him," muttered one of the crew, a smaller, wiry alien named Pex. He'd been silent up until now, his wide eyes darting back and forth as though expecting to see a shadow materialize into the human Deathworlder at any second. Zorak felt a chill run down his spine. He hated to admit it, but Pex was probably right. Humans, no Deathworlders, weren't like the soft diplomats they portrayed to the galaxy. Their planet, Earth, had bred survivors, hardened by nature and instinct. And now one was hunting them. Dane stalked the corridors behind them, his footfalls light and measured. He wasn't running, didn't need to. They were panicking, and panic led to mistakes. His heartbeat remained steady, his breathing controlled. His eyes scanned the path ahead, picking up the faint scent of burnt ion engines and metallic dust that clung to the air in this sector of the starport. The smugglers had left small traces in their wake, scuff marks on the floor, an occasional drop of spilled liquid. They couldn't hide. Not from him. He glanced at his wrist communicator. The tracker they'd foolishly triggered was leading him straight to them, but he didn't need it. His instincts told him everything he needed to know. They were close, too close to escape now. Zorak's lungs burned as they turned another corner, only to be met with a dead end. The cargo bay they had been counting on for an exit was locked down. Thick, reinforced doors stood before them, unyielding and cold. There would be no hacking through that. "We're trapped," Zerk rasped, his chest heaving with exertion. "What now?" "Shut up!" Zorak snapped, his mind racing. His hands clenched and unclenched, the weight of leadership bearing down on him. Every plan, every contingency, had failed. And still, that incessant beeping rang in his ears, reminding him of just how bad things had gotten. A sudden clatter from behind jolted them. Pex jumped, his wide eyes locked on the corridor they had just sprinted through. "He's here!" Zorak felt the hairs on the back of his neck rise. For a moment, the only sound was the sharp intake of breath as they waited. Then, from the shadows, a single, deliberate footstep echoed down the hall. "He's playing with us," Pex whispered. "Like we're prey." Zorak's blood boiled. He wouldn't be humiliated by a human, not like this. He gripped the small energy pistol at his side and took a step forward. "Enough of this," he growled. "We're getting out of here. Zerk, get that blasted tracker off!" But before Zerk could respond, a voice cut through the tension like a blade. Calm, cold, and in control. "You won't make it out of here alive!" Dane's figure emerged from the darkness at the far end of the corridor, his stance relaxed, almost casual. His weapon was holstered. He didn't need it, his presence alone was a weapon. His eyes locked onto Zorak's, unwavering and steady. "You've stolen from Earth," Dane continued, his tone flat but laced with an underlying threat. "And you won't live long enough to regret it." Zerk's claws trembled, the prototype slipping from his grasp and hitting the ground with a dull thud. The sound echoed in the stillness. Zorak gritted his teeth, his mind racing for a way out, but all he could think of was the predatory gleam in Dane's eyes, The eyes of a man who had faced worse than them and survived every time. Zorak's breath came in short, jagged bursts. His eyes darted toward the dim ceiling lights of the starport corridor, his mind racing to find an exit. The human, Dane, stood calmly at the other end of the hallway, his posture infuriatingly relaxed. That smugness, that confidence, it grated on Zorak's nerves. "Zerk, pick up the prototype," Zorak hissed under his breath. The device lay abandoned on the floor, its small frame gleaming in the flickering light. "We're not losing everything over some earthbred brute." Zerk swallowed hard and bent down, his thick claws trembling. As soon as his fingers touched the metal, a low hum vibrated from the device. Dane took a step forward. "I wouldn't do that," the human said, voice cold. "Not unless you want this entire sector on lockdown. You're toying with tech you don't understand. Then explain it to us." Zorak snarled, pulling his blaster and aiming directly at Dane. The smuggler's nerves were shredded by this point, but his resolve was fierce. He wouldn't be captured or humiliated. Not by a Deathworlder. Dane didn't flinch. He moved closer, his steps deliberate, like a predator closing in on a cornered prey. The tension in the corridor was suffocating. Zerk hesitated, clutching the device closer to his chest, unsure whether to drop it or use it. "I could explain," Dane said, taking another step. "But you wouldn't understand." His gaze locked onto Zorak, sharp as a blade. "You've already lost." Zorak's finger hovered over the blaster trigger, his mind torn between instinct and desperation. The calm confidence in Dane's voice made his stomach churn. Could this human really overpower them? They had numbers, they had weapons, but none of it seemed to matter against this relentless force. The stories they'd heard about Deathworlders started to creep into his mind, stories of impossible endurance, unmatched survival instincts. Before Zorak could act, the hiss of hydraulics echoed through the corridor. The security doors at the far end, their supposed escape route, slammed shut. Pex's already wide eyes grew impossibly larger. "We're trapped," Pex whispered, panic setting in. His voice cracked, sending a ripple of fear through the crew. "He's boxed us in." Dane's face remained impassive as the doors sealed shut, locking them all in the same space. The plan was simple: control the environment, limit their options, and break their will. Zorak's crew was predictable, like all criminals who overestimated their cunning. The starport was under partial lockdown now. Reinforcements were already on the way, but Dane preferred to finish this himself. There was something deeply satisfying about watching the moment when panic gave way to desperation, when the prey realized it couldn't escape. "You've been running long enough," Dane said, taking another step toward the huddled group. He stopped just a few paces away from Zorak, close enough to see the flicker of uncertainty cross the smuggler's face. "Surrender, and maybe, just maybe, you won't die here." Zorak's grip on the blaster tightened. He could feel his crew's eyes on him, waiting for him to make a decision. His throat tightened as the weight of leadership pressed down harder than ever. Every second stretched out, agonizing in its intensity. "What do you want?" Zorak finally spat, his voice hoarse. He couldn't see a way out, not yet, but he wasn't going to bow to this human without a fight. Dane tilted his head, examining Zorak with a measured gaze. "The prototype you stole. It's not yours. Hand it over, and you'll get to walk away." "You really think we'll believe that?" Zorak shot back, glaring at him. "You'll just kill us the moment we drop it." Dane shrugged slightly. "Maybe. But if you keep it, I guarantee that death is the least of your worries." "The thing you stole," he nodded at the device clutched in Zerk's claws, "isn't just tech. It's a weapon that Earth's best minds have barely managed to contain. You activate it without knowing how it works, you could blow a hole through this entire station." For the first time, a flicker of fear crossed Zerk's face. He stared down at the device, his claws trembling as if the weight of it had just doubled. "You're bluffing," Zorak growled, but his voice lacked conviction. "Am I?" Dane raised an eyebrow. "Do you want to find out?" Zerk looked at Zorak, eyes pleading for direction, for leadership. The hulking alien was strong, but fear made him weak, and Zorik could feel the grip of that same terror tightening around him too. "Drop it," Zorik said quietly, lowering his blaster. "What?" Pex whispered, his voice trembling. "You can't." "Shut up!" Zorik snapped, cutting him off. His chest rose and fell rapidly. He could see no other way. This was the moment he dreaded, the moment when every plan he had disintegrated, leaving him with nothing but survival instincts. Dane had them. He had them all, and fighting was no longer an option. With trembling hands, Zerk lowered the prototype to the ground, stepping back cautiously. A sharp breath of tension released from the air, but the atmosphere remained taut, like a string pulled too tight. The decision had been made, but they all knew this wasn't over. Dane stepped forward, his expression unchanged, yet there was a flicker of something else in his eyes. Maybe it was victory, maybe something darker. He knelt and retrieved the device, securing it in a small containment pouch on his belt. "You made the right choice," he said quietly. "But it's not up to me whether you live or die." Zorik's heart sank. From the corridor behind Dane, footsteps echoed, heavy, metallic, and unmistakably military. Reinforcements. Human reinforcements. Dane turned his back to Zorik and the crew, as though they were no longer a threat. As though the game had ended. "Lock them up," he ordered to the incoming soldiers. "We'll see if they know how to bargain." The cold, metallic clang of the starport cell door echoed through the confined space, a sound that seemed to vibrate inside Zorik's skull. He sat hunched on a bench, the weight of his defeat crushing him. The sterile light overhead flickered, casting eerie shadows that danced across the cold floor. Across from him, Zerk and Peck sat in silence, their usual boisterous energy drained. This was it. This was the end. Zorik stared blankly at the far wall, his mind racing for any way out, but every path led back to the same inescapable conclusion: they had lost. Worse, they had lost to a human. A Deathworlder had bested them, and now the entire crew was at the mercy of Earth's authorities. A hiss broke the silence as the cell door slid open. Dane stepped through, the same unreadable expression on his face, flanked by two heavily armored soldiers. Zorik could see the insignia of Earth's elite security forces on their shoulders. His stomach churned. "Comfortable?" Dane asked casually, as if the answer mattered. He glanced around the cell, assessing the three prisoners. Zorik didn't respond. His lips pressed into a thin line, trying to hide his loathing. He would not give this human the satisfaction of watching him grovel. Dane's gaze shifted from Zorik to the others, pausing briefly on Zerk. The towering alien shifted uncomfortably, his claws clicking together in nervous rhythm. Pex, usually the loud mouth of the group, sat in uncharacteristic silence, his eyes darting between Dane and Zorik. "You know," Dane began, pacing slowly in front of them, "there are certain things you learn when you've spent enough time dealing with people like you. Smugglers. Thieves." He paused, leaning against the wall, arms crossed. "It's not always about what you steal. Sometimes it's about who you steal from." Zorik's eyes narrowed. There was something in the human's tone that unsettled him. "What's that supposed to mean?" he spat, his voice sharper than intended. Dane's lips twitched into the faintest hint of a smirk, but he didn't answer right away. Instead, he turned his back to Zorik, his attention drifting toward the starport's window, where the distant lights of ships flickered in and out of view. "You stole the wrong thing from the wrong people," Dane said finally. "The prototype you took? It belongs to a group far more dangerous than you understand." "What, Earth's Tech Division?" Zorik scoffed. "We've dealt with—" "No," Dane cut him off, turning back to face him. "Not Earth." The room went silent, the weight of that statement sinking into the stale air. Zorik felt a knot of dread twist in his gut. There were few powers in the galaxy that could strike fear in the heart of seasoned smugglers like his crew, but the implications behind Dane's words. "Who?" Zerk asked hesitantly, his voice a low rumble. Dane took a slow breath, his eyes scanning each of their faces. "The Syndicate. You know who they are." Zorik froze. The Syndicate, a shadow organization so secretive that few outside its ranks even knew of its existence. A coalition of powerful crime lords, traitors, and rogue militaries. They were untouchable, invisible in the galactic order, and their wrath was legendary. "We've never stolen from them," Zorik muttered, disbelief creeping into his voice. "We never would." "That's the thing," Dane said, his smirk widening just a fraction. "You didn't know. The prototype? It's Syndicate tech disguised as Earth's." He paused, letting the gravity of the situation sink in. "And now they know exactly who took it." A sharp inhale filled the room as the realization hit. This wasn't about outsmarting a human. They had stumbled into a web far larger and more dangerous than any of them had anticipated. Earth's laws were one thing, but the Syndicate? They didn't deal in courts or prisons. They dealt in blood. "We're dead," Pex whispered, his voice barely audible. "Not yet," Dane said, pushing off the wall and stepping closer to the group. His tone was calm, almost too calm for the situation at hand. "That's where I come in." Zorik looked up, his expression guarded. "What do you want from us?" Dane knelt, bringing himself to eye level with the smuggler. "A deal. You work for me now." The air in the cell seemed to thicken as the words hung between them. Zorik's pulse quickened. "Working for a human? After all this?" "You're insane," Zorik spat. "We don't work for anyone." Dane's gaze didn't waver. "Your other option is waiting for the Syndicate to find you. And trust me, they will." A long, heavy silence followed. Pex's eyes darted around nervously, while Zerk kept his gaze locked on the floor. Zorik clenched his fists, his mind racing. They were already dead men walking, caught between Earth's security forces and the Syndicate's inevitable revenge. But this deal, this bargain, it was a sliver of hope, a potential way out. "What's the catch?" Zorik asked, his voice low, suspicious. Dane stood up, looking down at him with a gaze that was all business now. "Simple. You deliver intel to me, whenever I ask. No questions, no resistance. You'll get access to Syndicate information, things that could make you rich beyond belief. And if we refuse?" Dane's smile faded, replaced by something far colder. "Then you wait for the Syndicate. Your choice." The ultimatum was clear. They could either accept Dane's terms and live as reluctant pawns under his thumb, or they could face the full wrath of the most feared criminal organization in the galaxy. Zorik's throat felt tight. There was no good choice here. But in a galaxy ruled by power and greed, survival was the only thing that mattered. "Fine," Zorik said through gritted teeth. "We'll work for you." Dane's smirk returned. "Smart choice." He tapped a small device on his wrist, and the cell doors hissed open once more. As the human left, Zorik exhaled slowly, the weight of the decision settling on his shoulders. He had saved his crew for now, but at what cost?